advocacy 2015. I hope you had a great evening last night. I'm sure in the room that there's some very good winners of the Women Technologists of the Year Awards. I'm Miss Masterman, and together with my co-chair Amanda Jeffries, we've had a great day so far, looking forward to our final day together. Particular welcome if you've just joined us here today, or if you're logged in online to this live streaming session. Just to remind you to keep on tweeting to the #live and #LC to share us with your highlights. We'll have an update on the conference game at the end of your presentation. So I'm very, very excited to welcome Laura Czerniewicz from the University of Cape Town to give the keynote. Laura is Director of the Centre of Innovation in Learning and Teaching at the University of Cape Town. It has a very strong reputation for its work on OER in the South. It uses OER in the name of the out the world for the OER development project, security festival going on down there. Laura herself is a noted researcher and works informed by a number of thinkers and theorists from broader educational research and beyond. Today she's going to consider issues of inequality in online education. So please put your hands together for Laura.
And for ethical behaviour in the sector. What this has also meant is that we are not the only players in town. In fact, the universities are one player amongst a whole
online providers. We've actually been around the private sector providers, we've actually been around for the last 20 years, but in our space. now making sure that we're product. We're not paying, you know, that saying, you don't pay for the product. What this has all meant is that there's a recognition that this is the year of going online. And it's interesting that it's not just recognition in the higher education sector. So the Horizon report acknowledges going online, but so does The Economist, and so does Forbes. And so while 2012 was the year of the moon, it doesn't say that 2015 is the year that the mainstream has gone online. It's the year that traditional residential
my own, have started taking seriously this shift and started asking hard questions about what this actually means for traditional university. In the US, the online provision has been provided by private companies, and this is decreasing globally. Residential universities are actually shifting dramatically and rapidly into this space, and MOOCs have not gone away. I think this is important because those of us who've been concerned and critical about MOOCs have tended to think we can ignore them, and I think we actually can't ignore them. Probably the most important and interesting aspect of the online, and certainly from my perspective in the Global South, is the fact that it has a global orientation, not a local orientation. We are no longer simply talking about our students. We're talking about students everywhere, and it changes the entire landscape. And certainly the UK is very explicit, the British Council is very explicit about considering education as an export. And I was very interested to notice that even a recent JISC project talks about scaling up online for the global higher education marketplace. So we're not simply talking about our own students, we're talking about students all over the world. I think that it also means that we can assume, from a learning point of view, that all higher education learning is digitally mediated. It's a matter of how much rather than if. So this notion of the online classroom and the traditional classroom, I think that's over. And I think that Beetham's suggestion that we rather think about different types of learning and different types of learners that enable or require independent study or guided and supported learning is a much more useful way of thinking about it. And once again, this is particularly pertinent if one is considering a range of learners and interested in issues of inequality. So while all of this is going on, equality and inequality have at the same time and simultaneously become global concerns. There are a number of books that have been written about inequality and equality. It's almost become a growth industry in the scholarly sector, which is a sad state of affairs. I'm going to be drawing on Thurbin's work in a very broad brush sort of way, as I found it the most useful for thinking about issues of inequality, because he goes beyond resources and matters of economics. And he has a very simple definition of what we mean by equality. It's simply the capability to function fully as a human being. And he's very clear about the morality of this, the injustice of this. And also reminds us that we have to think about both individual and collective actions and think about systemic arrangements. He provides an incredibly useful framework that gives a heuristic that shows the multidimensionality of inequality. But of course, there's nothing new about this. And if we ignore the gender there and assume that we still believe today that it is self-evident that all people are created equal and that all are equal before nature and the law. Hundreds of years later, the situation has become more extreme rather than less so. Certainly our own constitution 20 years ago is premised on human dignity and the achievement of equality. But as I was saying, it's really a grave concern that the World Economic Forum says that the second trend, the most concerning trend in the world today, is widening income disparities. And that increasing inequality is the #1 concern in the US today. There are lots of different ways to measure inequality. I like the Palmer one because it's the ratio of the richest 10% divided by the poorest 40%, so it's quite an easy way to measure things. And of course, there are no surprises. I don't think this pointer is working. Yeah, is it working? There are no surprises about where the red bits are. Perhaps the surprises are where the purple bits are. So if you look at the US, for example, that's pretty sobering. In my own context, it's particularly dramatic. The 2 richest people in South Africa have the same amount of wealth as 50% of the population. We have the horrible situation of being top of the polls on the inequality stakes. We used to vie with Brazil. But it's not just the global south. And I was interested when I was preparing this talk to look and see where the United Kingdom lies in relation to the income distribution of the OECD countries. And it's the most unequal nation in Europe, with, of course, the US even more unequal. And in the UK, the richest 10% of households hold 44% of all wealth, and the poorest 50% own 9% of the wealth. How does this link to technology? Well, for many, the possibilities of technology are an essential part of addressing inequality. And I wouldn't be I'd be very careful about suggesting that this would be a determinist or a causal, direct issue, but there is no question that technology is part of the need for combating inequality, as the UN General Assembly has said, and even local mayors are now saying things like digital access is becoming as much an equity issue as access to water and electricity. And yet, I was fascinated to read through a number of reports, British and elsewhere, and surprised not to find the word equality, inequality, equity, disadvantage in any of them. So, obviously this is a concern. I'm not saying something we don't know. What we are grappling with is how to address this. And I think Mansell puts it really well. There are 2 prevailing social imaginaries. The prevailing dominant imaginary about digital technologies is market-led, and the alternative is opens or commons-led. And it's this conflict that leads to major problems for stakeholders in deciding which policies and strategies, or mix of policies and strategies, is most likely to facilitate progress towards more just and equitable information societies. And I don't believe that it's an either-or. I think we live in a hybrid situation. I think we've seen from history that a completely public-led and government-funded approach does not necessarily lead to equality. So the challenge we face is balancing. And yet, there's no question that the market-led approach is dominant. Educational technology funding is growing, so it hit 1.87 billion in 2014, and it's become global. So over 50% of educational technology investment in the last 2 years has been in non-US companies. And I was particularly interested to see that Coursera's latest roundup of investment included an Indian backer, an Indian investment. So it's not just as markets, but it's actually investment too. The counter-narrative, of course, is the Opens movement, the democratic movement. The Cape Town Open Education Declaration declares that each and every person should have access and contribute. And one of my concerns, which I hope we'll be able to discuss today, is that the Commons movement is not getting the same amount of attention and thought in terms of structures and resourcing as a counter-narrative. And all of this is happening while there are cuts, as were mentioned last night. So not only is fantastic work being done in the face of all these cuts, but the challenge is to do fantastic work that addresses issues of inequality in an austerity environment. A recent Oxfam report argues strongly that there is a need to take back public policy, and that we should be agreeing to spend at least 20% of government funding on education at a time where between 2008 and 2012, more than half of developing countries reduced spending on education. And those of us who are working in environments where transformation and decolonization is the predominant discourse are hearing repeatedly that transformation will not happen without a recapitalization of our higher education institutions. And so I end the section by asking the question, how can a values-led hybrid ecology of digitally mediated education provision be shaped that strikes a strategic balance between state support and private sector provision to prioritize and enable equality in higher education? So I'm an academic. I do the hard questions, not always the answers. So to go back to Thurgon, one of the reasons I like his work is that he talks about human beings in different ways, as organisms, as actors, and as persons. You think about vital inequality, and when I was preparing this, I was thinking, how does this, is education a life and death issue? And of course it is. We know that poor people are less likely to be educated. We know that educated people live longer. What I didn't know until I was preparing this talk, that parents of college graduates live longer too. And it's not irrelevant that more complex indicators of poverty alleviation are now including educational deprivation as one of the major indicators. In South Africa and in higher education in South Africa, we have serious concerns around inequality, not just of access, but of success. So our situation is challenging. 25% of students graduate in regulation time, and more than half of students who enroll never graduate. However, if we take race into account, the situation is much more dramatic. White completion rates on average are 50% higher than African completion rates. And about 5% of apartheid category black and coloured youth succeed in any form of higher education. In those early days of the MOOCs, there was some visionary and perhaps hyperbolic discourse about the democratization of higher education and the possibilities for online to solve poverty. And of course, we're academics, we looked at this lot and we said, pah, we don't like those kinds of grand statements. But I am concerned that by rejecting those kind of grand statements, we rejected a commitment to the possibilities, because of course we found that it hasn't been so easy. But I don't think we can give up on those possibilities. Of course, we know that MOOC students are highly educated, they're employed, and in BRICS countries, that's the Russia, India, Brazil, and South Africa, and China countries. Then the MOOC participants are more educated than the general population, and they're older. And we also know that online is more challenging, so there's some really interesting studies that show that while all students suffer Those who suffer more are males, younger students, black students, and students with lower grade point averages. This is based on a very, very large data set. So online's not going to be easy in terms of solving these problems. And certainly in Africa, where we are so short of resources, my colleague from OER Africa puts it very well when she says, most universities and most academics in Africa don't have the luxury to invest time and resources into anything simply on the basis that it's a good thing to do. If it will solve an existing problem, then it's a no-brainer. It's got to solve a problem. So one of the things I'd like to make a plea for today is to bring back the discussion to how we can use this new landscape to resolve some of these very serious challenges. And I would argue that we need to grow that small body of literature that does exist. There is some very interesting and innovative literature and research that's being done on the possibilities of new forms of provision in fragile environments with disadvantaged students. And so my plea would be, can we do more of that? Can we find out in which conditions certain things might be valuable and could work? And I do think we need to be drawing policy attention back to these issues. So, time for another hard question. Which forms of blended and online education can best serve the social and economic interests of developing countries and of the disadvantaged in all unequal societies? Resource inequalities, of course. Here, Bourdieu is fantastically helpful. He gives us a language for talking about resources in a broader way. And inevitably, if we talk about resources, we talk about contestations of power. But let's get back to basics. Assumptions about electricity. The map is always dramatic, isn't it? In what it shows about what we can assume about the online and about electricity provision. And it's not just those places on the map. Load shedding, which is one of those lovely misnomer words, if ever I heard one, has become part of my life and part of our life in South Africa, to the point that popular magazines ask, what do you do in the dark? We have load shedding schedules. We plan meetings for load shedding periods. Our library tells you what the hours will be during load shedding. So at a time where resources are running short throughout the world and countries like South Africa are experiencing electricity shortages, I'm not sure that we can continue to assume that electricity will simply be there for everyone throughout the world. And internet access remains the exception, not the rule. The percentage of the population who use the internet once in a year, these are 2014 figures. Globally it was 34%, but if you look at it by developing countries and developed countries, there's a huge difference. 76% versus 29%, and of course location is key. In sub-Saharan Africa, 13% of the population is connected. And income is key. In the US, 99% of US adults who earn over 75,000, but 70% of those who earn less than 30,000. So we all believe that mobile is the answer. And it's looking good. It is looking good. And I too think that there is a great opportunity with mobile. But the problem with mobile is we tend to be talking about the devices. Everyone has a device. Many people have more than one device. The opportunity with mobile is in the data and the data costs. If you calculate affordability at 5% of monthly income, then in sub-Saharan Africa, 53% can afford access at entry level. Before entry level, just enough for SMS and email. And those figures for connectivity, for fully connected, what you would really need for online, become particularly sobering indeed. And of course, this has a lot of implications for learning design for mobile and the assumptions that are made about smartphones. Certainly in developing countries, people have very practical views about what they want connectivity for. They want to increase their earning power, and they want to increase their access to education. What does this mean in summary? We have more diverse student populations than ever before. We have a greater diversity of delivery forms than ever before, and we have widely differentiated cultural capital. And the literature shows that to date we've done really badly as a sector dealing with part-time students, flexible students, and non-traditional students. And they are going to become the dominant types of students that we're dealing with. And our universities are not well set up to serve them. This is an institutional, systemic issue. This is not only a learning design issue. It does mean seriously rethinking digital literacies. So you find literature that describes this perfect online learner who has a strong academic self-concept, is competent, engages, strong interpersonal skills, self-directed. This is the elite. This reminds me a little bit of that fantasy about the digital native. I think the reality is captured in Beetham's research, where she talks about the differentiated nature of digital literacies. That digital skills are shallower than we've anticipated, full of contradictions, that most of those activities, you know, the ones that people all design themselves and do themselves, are introduced by the educators, and that consumer practices and populist values dominate in the digital space. This is a much more sobering version of what we're actually dealing with. What about institutional capital? Well, this is an interesting one. I think that certification is an equity issue. It's about the legitimacy of new forms of provision. It's very interesting that 70% of students with Coursera credentials list this on their LinkedIn profiles. I actually did a search. I was looking for some of my colleagues, and people list their final certifications as forms of professional development, along with all of the other kinds of certification. This is accurate, and in my view, it is shifting the legitimacy of these types of certification. And for many in developing countries, this is the crux of the matter. The qualification is what helps you get a job which puts food on the table. And until we can get verifiable accreditation right for free online courses, I don't think there'll be much traction. And I think this is the most interesting area to be watching as things shift in this space. But in a way, probably the hardest area to engage with is what Thurborn calls existential inequality. And these are his terms: self-development, autonomy, freedom, dignity, and respect. And these, of course, pertain very strongly to the work that we do as educators. They're about power, they're about agency, they're about ownership, they're about choice. And they pertain right across the sector, through the disciplines, within and across institutions. They're about the nature of relationships. This is the really hard stuff. They're about who decides. And this is where one sees the extent of the resentment around what's happening in the global landscape. So Mbembe, who I quoted earlier, says the rescaling of the university is meant to achieve one single goal: to turn it into a springboard for global markets. The brutality of this competition is such that it has opened a new era of global apartheid in higher education. In this new era, winners will graduate to the status of world-class universities and losers will be relegated and confined to the category of global bush colleges, and that is not a compliment. We're familiar with some of the critiques about MOOCs, and very reputable professors, including Altbach, talking about the neo-colonialism of language, about evangelical arguments and self-appointed saviors of the less civilized ruling the airways on the global front. And great resentment. This is about feelings of existential inequality. And certainly, I think it is a very serious concern and critique that we're seeing the dangers of the flattened colonization of knowledge. There are calls for universal knowledge not to mean the knowledge of the global north, but a pluriversalism, a horizontal strategy of openness to dialogue amongst different epistemic traditions. And this, of course, is much harder. In South Africa, we have spent much of this year addressing the issues raised through the Rhodes Must Fall movement. And the image there is actually of the moment when the Rhodes statue at the University of Cape Town was physically removed. It came to epitomize anger, resentment, concerns about the curriculum, about power relations, about inequality, about white privilege. And these are issues that spread beyond South Africa to universities around the world, including in the UK, and have raised and surfaced incredibly important issues which pertain to the online space as much as they do to the face-to-face space. So it's about reshaping relationships. It's about reclaiming that network society, the one that Castells was so optimistic about. It's about shifting from a broadcast model, which is what we've seen to date in those online courses where the rest of the world is the customer. It's about reshaping that read-write web, shifting that consumer culture, and really moving the notion of access to become one of access meaning participation. And I'll just give you an example of the MOOCs. I had a look on some of the MOOC aggregators for the MOOCs that are running about Africa, that have been running about Africa, and where they come from. It's coincidence that the first one was in Manchester. Aberdeen, Leiden, and Emory. These are about Africa. Am I saying that universities in the global north should not be running MOOCs about Africa? Of course not. That's too simplistic. But I am saying that fostering partnerships and collaborative relationships around these kinds of provision is essential. And it is happening. It's harder. If you have a MOOC between Brazil and Leiden or in Delft, it's harder. And if you have one between Oslo, Malawi, China, and Stanford, it's definitely harder. But I think it's the right thing to do. And that's another plea from me, to foster these kinds of collaborative MOOC creations. Talking about the hard things, one of my colleagues in Australia put it so well that I just decided to quote her directly. She talks about, to recognize digital learning as the practice that networks small higher education institutions to global circuits of influence and profits, we need to think about the strategic withholding of reciprocity. So instead of withholding reciprocity, I think we need to be engaging with and providing reciprocity. And we need to be thinking about the obligations of care. This is a new discourse that I've been coming across recently, which I would hope that we'll be able to explore. I can't talk about inequality without talking about language, because 80% of all content online is in one of 10 languages. But I can say that there is some exciting research being done on the rise of language communities, which I would suggest we all keep a very close eye on. as a kind of counter to the dominance of particular languages. And I have to remind everyone that most language online, most content online comes from the global north. And ironically, the open access policies that have been predominant in Europe and the UK have made this more difficult for people in the global south, because it means that the content online is not being found from the global south. And online representation matters. What you find shapes what you come to know. So another plea from me is to sign the Hague Declaration around the discoverability of all content online. And very briefly, I do have to mention the elephant in the room. No one likes talking about copyright. But if you're going to put Creative Commons licenses onto materials, it's essential to make them remixable and adaptable. Otherwise, it's just another version of the broadcast model. And my concern also is that user-generated content should be owned by users. So we need to be designing for diversity. I have a colleague who talks about two kinds of diversity. He says it's like cholesterol. There's a good kind and a bad kind. And the good kind is enriching, and the bad kind reinforces inequality. There's fantastic work being done around diversity and learning design for diversity in the online space. It's really important. Principles of cultural inclusion, leveraging research on cultural inclusion into large-scale classes, it's very important work. And I think we do have to be looking at these new business models for increasing opportunities of access, new forms of certification. It's not trivial that these forms of professional development are gaining legitimacy. I think they do matter. And of course, the hard stuff. We have to distinguish between equity of access and of outcomes. And this brings us back to that other enormous challenge, which is about supportive strategies and supportive environments. And I know the Open University in the UK has done a lot of very good work about the cost of support. The cost of support costs, it's that simple. And I would also add that care costs. I worry that this new discourse of care is another form of unpaid labor. Paying attention costs. It costs time and it costs attention. So I've got my 5 minutes. I'm in my last few minutes. So in conclusion, issues of inequality pervade the entire landscape. We can't escape that. And the question I really have to ask in summary is, how can we ensure that values-based, pedagogically shaped online learning in an austerity environment and a hybrid higher education ecology does exist? So, as I said at the beginning, I'm not a disinterested party, and I think we need three things. We need critical research. We need inequality framed and inequality shaped experimentation. We need policy and we need advocacy, and perhaps what I'm doing now is a form of that kind of advocacy. By critical, I mean critical in all senses of the word. I mean in the sense of important, I mean in the sense of argumentative, I mean in the sense of surfacing power. Policymakers like research-based evidence, and I think it's our job to be researching this changing environment more than ever before, in fact. And we need to be theorizing our scholarship. And that theory needs to be helping us understand this extraordinary landscape, because change has happened before we've come to understand their implications, and then new practices are in place. We are being caught off guard if we're concerned about values and a values-based pedagogy. I think we, and I hope that I'm speaking for many people here, need to be experimenting with new forms of business models that supports a commons approach. I think that the commons approach is weakened at the moment and needs a lot more attention. I think we need to be innovating with these new forms of provision, experimenting, trying out new things with a specific question of how can this support the needs of the disadvantaged. And yes, I think policy matters. If you understand policy to mean the allocation of goals, values, and resources, it provides the enabling environment. I know it can go wrong. I know the open access policy framework hasn't always done what we had hoped it would do, but we cannot escape the policy framing possibilities of the work that we do. And of course, we need advocacy to remind and to challenge and to explain. So my last word is, if issues of inequality and inclusion are accepted as crucial issues and critical absences in the global online higher education landscape, we must foster communities of policy, research, and practice to find shared solutions amongst a range of parties from different parts of the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. That was absolutely stunning, mind-blowing. Could, are we getting in position for the questioning? You're going to take the questions yourself, Laura.
I'm happy to do that.
We've got actually well over 10 minutes for questions, and I think you have inspired with so many thoughts.
Liz put the fear of God in me. She said I had too many slides.
I didn't.
And I must be sure to leave enough time, so if I went too fast, it's not my fault.
Didn't say too many slides. Anyway,
Yes.
questions?
And no, I don't know the answer, so if your question is, so what do we do, that's it.
Let's remind you to say who you are and where you're from, of course.
Hi, Tom Wilson, University of Southampton. So, specifically in my context, I'm in the School of Chemistry in a very research-led university, and I completely agree with everything you said, to start off with that. So my work is very dedicated to a specific subject in a specific school within a specific university. What can I do to be helping to contribute towards solving this problem on a global level? Who can I be talking to about my work? Where can I go for resources? Because at the end of the day, I've got to answer to my PhD supervisor, to my school, to my university's policies, and especially with stuff like the copyright stuff you're talking about. That's, like you said, it's the elephant in the room. No one really likes to talk about it. So what can I do?
So there are no quick fixes. I think that really is a serious matter. If change is to happen and be taken seriously, it involves consultation. It involves consultation with students. It involves piloting. It involves ownership. I think one thing, somebody once told me, when you have an unpopular view and you go into a room, you must always assume that there's one person there who agrees with you and you don't yet know who they are. And I'm quite sure that in the work that you do, there are people who are struggling with the same things that you're struggling with. And so I really think that this finding communities of people sharing problems and working together is actually the only way forward. The other alternative is to give up. So there are people in the chemistry community, certainly at the University of Cape Town there are. In fact, chemistry is one of the areas where the extended programs have been the most useful and done some very good work. There are lessons to be learnt, and it's a matter of sharing those lessons kind of one step at a time.
Diana Laurelard, UCL. Laura, I thought that was an absolutely brilliant analysis of the intellectual and ethical issues around inequality that must concern our community of learning technologists. And absolutely agree with what you said about looking for what MOOCs can do for us in this global inequality issue. Making the best of it and trying to drive them forward to what they could do, and certainly in the area of speaking to the educated, to the professionals, professional development, there are things we can do. And we need to engage them and listen and learn, and driving MOOC development towards being able to do that better than is currently very easy. But there was a curious phrase that you quoted, the strategy for withholding reciprocity, that I couldn't make sense of in the context of everything else you were saying. I wonder if you could just elaborate on what that means and why it's important.
Well, that was a quote, so I will have to tell you my interpretation of what it means. I think it means my own understanding is that it refers to a kind of market-led approach to exploiting possibilities. And I can give you some examples. I mean, one of the things that is very interesting about what's going on in this space is that with the kind of global possibilities of online collaboration, there is a possibility for elite universities to work together. So my university, being the top university in Africa, has a lot of knocks on the door from companies wanting elite universities to work with other elite universities to serve the elite. And to my mind, that's a form of withholding the possibilities of reciprocity, of serving the broader educational needs of the system. It's like the easy, low-hanging fruit. That's what that's my reading of it.
Hi, I'm Alan Dix from Tallis and University of Birmingham. And really it's just, I mean, it was a fantastic talk, so thank you very much. And really just to perhaps add a few things to it, which is things in Britain, you mentioned the US. I live on an island. When people say online and accessible, no, it's not, particularly video materials. I was mentioning in one of the sessions earlier in the conference, my heart broke when the OU programs went off the television, because as a child, they changed my life. And online video for somebody in my position, in equivalent position now, I wouldn't have it. Similarly, went all the way around Wales 2 years ago, around the peripheries of Wales, saw 3G access once apart from around Cardiff and Swansea. All the rural areas, nothing, and broadband access virtually non-existent as well. And it is, it is a story. It's not just about education. The open data movement has the same. The evidence is the production and the use of open data. So it's not, no, probably not a question, and neither is it a solution. But certainly when we look at, particularly at openness, which seems to be, on its own, openness is like the open Sahara, and it favours the strong and disfavours the weak. And so we do have to, I don't know what to do, but we do have to do very specific, work hard if we're to make openness actually benefit those who are not the existing strong. Yeah.
And I mean, I think I would add there that we do have to be paying more attention to things like structures and business models and economic models, and we do have to differentiate between for-profit companies and not-profit companies. They're not the same. And it's very easy to just disengage with anything that sounds like commercial or for-profit, and therefore it actually puts us on a weaker foot, I think. So I really would like to see us paying more attention to how we can actually build sustainable models in quite a practical way.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, Will Burrows, OCR. It was a fascinating presentation. Thank you very much and very thought-provoking. From my perspective, which is crossing commercial into HE and funded organisations, most people engaged in producing commercial educational content think that making a living is a profit, and fail to do it. YouTube must be the biggest global educator, and most of the people producing content there of a quality that is decided entirely by the audience and therefore in the right way are there for themselves, because education is ultimately about excluding people from wealth, and on the other side, from trying to attain wealth. And organisations that organise access to wealth through education tend to screw it up by one means or another. And it's people working individually to be seen, to gain value from their product, particularly if that's their intellect and their intellectual property, have to work very hard to do that without losing it. And so I wonder, I'm very dubious about organisations saying, give away your product, because we will find another way of giving you value. It becomes very exclusive, and your look at Bush colleges. I've always seen Bush colleges as the acme of education, and the ideal way of delivering education, entirely localized, entirely specific to the people who are there, and empowering Bush colleges as being what online can offer, and the sort of global stratification of education through elite universities and things like that as being an inevitable but fairly appalling outcome of education. What do you think?
Well, I won't answer the question about Bush colleges because it has a very particular derogatory meaning in the South African context, so that's really about connotations. I think the issue you raise about intellectual property is very interesting, though, and I think the questions of copyright are particularly important. We've done research, and research has been done all over the world. Piracy is ubiquitous. The current system doesn't work. This is a given. And so the kind of contestations that are going on around intellectual property are really important. And, we were talking yesterday over dinner about different approaches to addressing the changing intellectual property environment. And the two Lawrences, there's Lawrence Lessig, who is the person who invented Creative Commons licenses, and then there's Lawrence Liang, who's going to be talking at Network Learning next year. And he says, the system's broken. We've got to think about different ways to build it. The copyright system does not serve a digital age. We have to engage. I don't think anyone is suggesting that one does not want to take away the ownership and the attribution, and I don't think anyone remotely believes that creating content doesn't cost money. But the current systems of rewarding intellectual property ownership are not working. And I think in that we agree.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Hi, Roger Harrison, University of Manchester.
Oh, hello.
This evening I'm going to be preparing my talk to introduce our students. We run an online distance learning course in public health. So it was really interesting, to hear your talk because it's been 20 years of my work. I suppose what was going through my mind is here we are in a £13 billion capital investment academic institution, as far as I understand it, and in the city as a whole. But when MOOCs first came around, there was all this scaremongering about, well, in 3 years' time, you're not going to have a job, Roger, so what are you going to do? And I was just wondering, where do you think people like me and many of us in the room who are employed by universities will be in 5 years' time?
Well, I can't see the future. But the present,
go on, have a guess.
But the present's not looking good for permanent positions in academic work, as far as I can see. I mean, we are seeing the increased casualization of academic work as we speak. So I would like to see the kind of discussions we're having and the kind of fighting back that we're doing will work against that. But my own feeling is I'm not feeling very optimistic on that front.
Can I just interrupt here and say two more questions? There's a lady down here and a gentleman over there. And as we're getting short of time and Maren needs to give us some housekeeping instructions, can we keep our questions short, please? Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. Moira Maley, Rural Clinical School of Western Australia, University of Western Australia. Publishing in open access journals is one way of feeling as though you're contributing to wider distribution of worthwhile work. However, from within a research-intensive university, you're under pressure to publish in high-impact factor journals, which are usually associated with the big publishing companies, where I think a lot of money is being put at the moment. what is the answer to fighting back against open access journals? Is it policy changes within the institutions?
So you've asked about 4 different questions there.
Sorry.
And open access publishing it's a business model. It's got nothing to do with quality. It's a different way of doing things. It's got nothing to do with impact. It's a very simple issue that has been made very complicated. And I think we'd better talk about it afterwards. I think that some of the myths that have grown around open access publishing and some of the policy decisions that have been made have not helped. But I don't think that there is an alternative, and certainly the existing alternative is worse, much worse.
Sorry. Hello, I'm Donovan Simoy from Goldsmiths College. Thanks very much, Laura, for a fantastic talk. I've just got a slightly provocative question, which is that from your unique perspective on the kind of global situation, what would you advise a body like ALT with a perspective across the entire sort of UK education area? What would your 3-point advisory be?
Provocative and on the spot. Number 1, carry on doing what you do so well. I'm not the sort of person who makes things up and says this is my favorite conference. I think that the kind of values that inform this community are important. Number 2, grow networks outside of the UK, because I think the point I wanted to make was that these are not national specific issues. These are increasingly global issues as we go online, and the strata of society really changes from being national, and the notion of those kinds of borders really is falling away every day. And number 3, you'll have to give me some time to think about. 2 out of 3 is not bad.
That's great, thank you.
I think sadly we must end it there. I think we could have gone on for the rest of the morning with questions. So thank you very much once again to Laura. I was just sitting in the front and feeling a particular atmosphere during your talk. I think you've really challenged us with a lot of hard-hitting issues. I'd like to present you ALT's resolutely non-digital gift to say thank you very much indeed.
Thank you to Laura, and thank you to everybody here. Before you